New DNA evidence now connects specific Neanderthals and modern humans in Ice Age Europe, and may even reveal your own ancestry. Meladec cave and Spy cave show genetics and morphology that show mixture, not replacement. The caves of Mladeč in Moravia occupy a quiet limestone hill above the Morava River valley in what is now the Czech Republic. At first glance, the site appears to be simply another Upper Paleolithic cave system, yet its fossils have played an outsized role in debates about human evolution for more than a century. The remains discovered there belong to some of the earliest modern-looking humans known in Central Europe, people associated with the Aurignacian culture roughly 35,000 years ago. But one skull in particular, Mladeč 5, has repeatedly challenged the simple narrative that a population of modern humans from sub-Saharan Africa swept into Europe around 45,000 years ago and quickly replaced Neanderthals with only limited interbreeding. When examined carefully and compared to earlier fossils such as the Neanderthal skull from Spy Cave and the so-called early modern humans of Kafze Cave and Skull Cave, Mladeč 5 instead suggests that hybrid populations persisted deep into the Upper Paleolithic. Excavations revealed that the caves contained the remains of several individuals, including 2 adult males and a child discovered together in a collapsed side chamber. These 3 skeletons were found in a small area sealed beneath a rockfall, which suggests the possibility that they had been intentionally buried. The adult male cranium known as Mladeč 5 came from this discovery. The skull represents an extraordinary window into the biological character of the earliest Upper Paleolithic populations of Central Europe. Mladeč 5 consists of a long, low cranial vault belonging to a robust adult male. Its overall proportions are striking. The skull is elongated and relatively low compared with later Upper Paleolithic humans, yet it lacks some of the extreme features of Neanderthals. The brow ridges are present, but not as massively developed as those of classic Neanderthal specimens. The cranial vault is expanded compared with earlier archaic humans, yet its shape still carries a primitive appearance. In many respects, the skull appears intermediate between the 2 major human populations known from the late Pleistocene, the Neanderthals of Europe and the early modern humans of the Levant. Researchers who studied the Mladeč remains recognized this mixture of features from the beginning. In fact, the original comparative framework used to analyze the skull explicitly considered 3 possibilities: that the Mladeč population descended from European Neanderthals alone, that it descended from early modern humans, such as those found at Skull and Kafze, or that it represented a mixture of the 2 groups. To understand why the 3rd possibility is so important, one must examine the comparative fossils themselves. The Neanderthal skull from Spy in Belgium, known as Spy 2, represents a classic example of the late Neanderthal anatomy that dominated Europe between about 200,000 and 40,000 years ago. Spy 2 displays the hallmark characteristics of Neanderthal morphology: an elongated cranial vault, a prominent brow ridge, a receding forehead, and a distinctive occipital bun at the back of the skull. The face is large and projecting, and the midface is expanded around the nasal cavity. Yet recent genetic discoveries have revealed something even more intriguing about these late European Neanderthals. Studies of ancient DNA show that most Neanderthals living between 70,000 and 40,000 years ago belonged to a single mitochondrial lineage that had spread across Europe during a demographic expansion roughly 65,000 years ago. This lineage appears in Neanderthal fossils from sites such as Saint-Césaire, Les Côtes, El Cidron, Spy, and the famous discovery site Feldhofer Grotte in Germany. The Spy individuals belong to this same late mitochondrial lineage. In other words, the Neanderthals living across Europe during the final 20,000 years of their existence were not isolated relic populations, but members of a widespread and genetically connected demographic expansion. Earlier Neanderthal populations, which carried different mitochondrial lineages, appear to have been gradually replaced or absorbed during this expansion. This genetic background is crucial for understanding the Mladeč skull. The Neanderthals that the earliest Aurignacian humans encountered in Europe were not ancient archaic populations stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. They were members of this relatively recent late Neanderthal expansion. By contrast, the Levantine fossils from School and Kafse, dated roughly between 120,000 and 90,000 years ago, have often been described as early modern humans. The skull Kafse 9, for example, has a more rounded cranial vault and reduced brow ridges compared with Neanderthals. Yet even these Levantine fossils are not identical to modern humans. Their faces are still large and robust, and some specimens display features that resemble Neanderthals. When the Meladec skull is placed between these two earlier groups, its intermediate nature becomes apparent. In lateral view, the calvarium resembles a softened version of the Neanderthal form. The vault is long and low, like that of Spy 2, yet the brow ridges are reduced, and the forehead is somewhat more vertical. The skull therefore appears younger and more modern than the Neanderthal specimen, but not fully modern either. The detailed comparative studies that first analysed the Mladeč remains illustrated this relationship directly, placing Mladeč 5 between casts of Kafse 9 and Spy 2 to show how the three relate to one another morphologically. This visual comparison raises an obvious question. If modern humans arriving from Africa had rapidly replaced the Neanderthals of Europe around 40,000 years ago, why does a European skull from that period still retain so many Neanderthal-like traits? The conventional answer has been interbreeding. According to the standard narrative, modern humans entered Europe from the Near East and occasionally interbred with the local Neanderthal populations before those populations went extinct. Genetic studies have indeed confirmed that people living outside Africa today carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. But the morphology of Mladeč 5 suggests something more complex than a brief episode of gene flow during a rapid replacement. The skull appears to represent a population that had already blended traits from both lineages. Rather than a fully modern human with a few Neanderthal features, the specimen looks like part of a long-standing hybrid population. Its anatomy does not match the idea of a sudden influx of African migrants who replaced the Neanderthals almost immediately after arriving in Europe. Chronology strengthens this interpretation. The Mladeč fossils belong to the Aurignacian cultural horizon, which marks the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic in much of Europe. This period begins roughly 40,000 years ago and represents the earliest widespread evidence of modern human technology on the continent. If Neanderthals had already disappeared or been replaced by that time, one would expect the earliest Aurignacian humans to look fully modern. Instead, the Mladeč population retains clear archaic features. The persistence of these features suggests that Neanderthal ancestry remained visible in European populations long after the supposed replacement event. The archaeological context of the site further complicates the traditional narrative. The tools and ornaments found in the cave belong entirely to the Aurignacian cultural tradition. Bone points, decorated awls and pendants made from animal teeth were recovered alongside the human remains. These artifacts are typical of the earliest Upper Paleolithic cultures of Central Europe, and demonstrate that the people who lived in the cave were fully capable of producing the symbolic and technological innovations usually associated with modern humans. Yet the anatomy of their skeletons tells a different story. Rather than representing a completely new population arriving from another continent, the Mladeč individuals appear biologically connected to earlier Eurasian groups. This mixture makes sense when viewed from a broader evolutionary perspective. Europe and the Near East were not isolated regions during the late Pleistocene. Instead, they formed a connected network of populations that repeatedly expanded, contracted, and exchanged genes during climatic fluctuations. The late Neanderthal mitochondrial lineage that spread across Europe around 65,000 years ago demonstrates how dynamic these population movements could be. Neanderthals themselves were expanding and replacing earlier groups long before the arrival of Aurignacian culture. Meanwhile, populations with more modern features existed in the Levant. As climates changed and populations shifted their ranges, these groups likely met and interbred many times. If this interpretation is correct, The earliest Upper Paleolithic humans of Europe may not have been migrants who replaced Neanderthals, but rather descendants of populations that had already been mixing for tens of thousands of years. By the time Aurignacian culture appeared in Central Europe, these hybrid populations may have been widespread across the continent. Modern genetic research increasingly supports this view. Studies of ancient DNA from early Upper Paleolithic humans in Europe have revealed individuals with substantial Neanderthal ancestry, sometimes much higher than that seen in present-day populations. These findings indicate that interbreeding occurred repeatedly during the early stages of the Upper Paleolithic. Meladec 5 represents one of the physical manifestations of that process. Its anatomy suggests that hybridization was not a rare or isolated event, but a fundamental component of human evolution in late Pleistocene Eurasia. The destruction of most of the Mladeč fossils during the Second World War makes the surviving skull even more valuable. It stands as one of the few direct pieces of evidence from a population that lived at the crucial moment when Neanderthals and modern humans were interacting across Europe. When viewed alongside the Neanderthals of Spy and the early modern humans of School and Kafse, the skull tells a story that is far more complicated than the traditional replacement narrative. Rather than a simple migration followed by extinction, the evidence points toward a prolonged period of coexistence, interbreeding, and gradual transformation. The reason Spy is so important is that genetically it sits extremely close to the Neanderthal population that contributed DNA to living humans. When geneticists try to estimate Neanderthal ancestry in modern people, they need a reference Neanderthal genome to compare against modern human DNA. For a long time, the best high-quality genome came from Vindiger Cave, and that individual belongs to the same late Neanderthal population cluster as Spy Cave. Those late European Neanderthals share a very similar genetic profile. When researchers compare modern human genomes with Neanderthal genomes, they find that the introgressed segments in living people match Vindiger-like and Spy-like Neanderthals much better than they match older Neanderthals from places such as Siberia. For example, the famous Denisova Cave Neanderthal genome, the Altai Neanderthal, is genetically more distant from the Neanderthal DNA carried by modern humans. That means the population that interbred with modern humans was probably closer to Western Eurasian Neanderthals, the same population that includes Spy, Vindiger, Feldhofer, and the late French sites. So when you look at the map showing the 70 to 40,000 year population, that group is not just the last Neanderthals in Europe. It is very likely the same broad population that encountered modern humans and mixed with them somewhere in Western Eurasia or the Near East. That is why the pattern in the map matters. Around 65,000 years ago, one mitochondrial lineage spreads across Europe and becomes dominant. Then roughly 60,000 years ago, modern humans outside Africa acquire Neanderthal DNA. The two events are almost perfectly aligned in time, suggesting that the Neanderthals involved in the admixture event were members of that same expanding late Neanderthal population. This also explains why late sites such as Les Côtes, El Cidron, Spy and Feldhofer Grotte cluster so tightly together in the mitochondrial tree. They represent the final widespread Neanderthal population across Europe, the group that persisted until about 40,000 years ago. In practical terms, that means when scientists say modern humans carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA, they are largely talking about DNA inherited from individuals genetically similar to the Neanderthals from Spy and Vindiger, rather than from the older Neanderthal populations that lived in Eurasia 100,000 years earlier. And this is where the Saint-Césaire fossil becomes interesting again. Even though we do not yet have DNA from that skeleton, its age, geography and cultural association place it right inside the territory of this same late Neanderthal population. In other words, the individual from Saint-Césaire was almost certainly part of the same final Neanderthal demographic wave that includes the Spy individuals and the Vindiger Neanderthals. That is why sites in southwestern France, Belgium, Germany and Croatia appear so tightly connected in the genetic maps. They are not separate, isolated groups. They are fragments of a single late Neanderthal population network, stretching across much of Europe in the last 20,000 years, before Neanderthals disappeared. The early Aurignacian humans of Central Europe were not purely modern humans, nor purely Neanderthals. They were something in between, descendants of populations that had been meeting and mixing for tens of thousands of years. Mladeč 5 therefore occupies a pivotal place in the human evolutionary record. It represents a moment when the boundaries between human groups were still fluid, when the traits of Neanderthals and modern humans were still blending together. Far from supporting the idea of a rapid replacement of Neanderthals by migrants from Africa, the skull instead suggests that the first Upper Paleolithic Europeans were the products of a much deeper and more complex evolutionary history going back over 100,000 years. Thanks for watching.